Now, just a brief reminder of our contact details, 53106, or send me a tweet at Ian Guider, because we're going to talk pensions for the next few minutes, because the Social Protection Minister, Joan Burton, has rode back on a deadline of the end of this month for pension funds to come up with a new funding scheme. We know defined benefit pension plans are under severe funding pressure, so the government is trying to alleviate that. So have the measures announced the other day worked? Samantha McConnell is Chief Investment Officer with IFG Pensions, and she's with me in studio. Samantha, very good morning to you. There was a change coming up at the end of this month where defined benefit pension plans would have to put in additional reserves over and above their liabilities just to make sure that there will be payouts for people if anything happened. That's been changed a little bit. Will the measures do any good?
Well, first of all, we do welcome the announcement from the Minister, but certainly our view is it's a sticky plaster and a gaping wound that is the pensions, DB pensions at the moment, or defined benefit pensions as they're known. The reality is, Ian, that 80 to 90% of schemes are currently in deficit. Now, what that means is they can't actually meet their current liabilities, let alone fund for risk reserves. So reducing the risk reserve requirement from 15 to 10%, while it sounds great and over the longer term may make some differences, the reality is for a lot of schemes it's not going to make a huge amount of difference. The reality is they are faced, or a lot of schemes and employers are now faced with putting in funding proposals before the 30th of June, and they're doing that in an environment that is extremely uncertain. Many schemes and many employers, indeed with the industry, were hoping for some change in the priority order in the Social Welfare Act, and effectively that can has been kicked down the road very firmly by the Minister.
Yeah, that means that if a pension fund is wound up, if you're currently drawing a pension, you'll be guaranteed your income, but anybody who's paid into it, well, they'll be left to fend for themselves.
Correct, and ultimately all the industry was looking for was a fairer distribution of assets. It seems grossly unfair to me anyway that if you're 65 and retired, you get everything, and if you're 64 and a half and not retired, you get very little. And ultimately that, combined with the huge uncertainty in the environment that has been brought about by not only the Waterford Crystal case, which will come back to the High Court in September, but also the recent recommendations coming out of the OECD review, creates what I think is almost a vacuum within which we're asking employers and trustees to effectively agree a long-term funding commitment that can go out almost 11 years. And my own view, I think, for if you're an employer faced with that scenario, what are you going to do? That the most certain outcome for you is to wind up your DB scheme if you can. And it is, I think, more likely that more DB schemes will wind up because, as I say, of this vacuum in the legislation.
But the Minister, Joan Burton, she has gone some way to recognise that, look, there are pressure on these schemes, about 1,000 of these schemes, and most of them, as you say, are in deficit, but they are doing minor changes. Will they help, I suppose, for a little time, to try and, before people come up with a proper plan?
I think, again, it's tinkering around the edges. It really is tinkering around the edges. I think the fundamental issue is that for DB schemes, the cost of running them has increased fourfold over the recent past. And if you're any employer, they want certainty around costs. And having any cost that runs out of control like that is not sustainable in the long term. What we require now is for the government ultimately to provide clarity, and that clarity is going to take time. We need to see what happens in the High Court with the Waterford Crystal case. But why have we got this artificial in respects funding proposal deadline on the 30th of June? Certainly my own view is that I would welcome a decision by the Pensions Board to move out the funding proposal deadline, to allow the government to provide clarity and to allow schemes and their employers to create long-term funding proposals with that clarity in mind.
Is it possible to have defined benefit pension plans now, because you know what your liabilities are going to be, you know that people are retired, you know what they're going to receive, but you don't know the funding side of it, you don't know how stock markets are going to perform, you don't know how bonds are going to perform. Is it time that we just did away with them altogether?
Well, I think that's ultimately where we're going to end up. If you look at what's happened in the US and in Australia, DB schemes are a thing of the past. There's very few of them left, and I think ultimately this industry will die, and whether it's death by 1,000 cuts or whether it'll die in a short time period, that will all depend on what comes out in future legislation. Ultimately, when employers signed up to DB, they didn't expect that it was going to cost them what it has cost them. And that is through a combination of, as you said, reduction in bond yields, investment markets not doing what they did for 20 years from 1980, people living longer, and that's not going to change, and also increased regulation. And that's has created, in my opinion, a perfect storm for DB pensions. And I'm not sure many will survive.
Is it legally possible to, I suppose, reduce the benefits current pensioners are getting?
It is under a process what's known as a Section 50. However, under that process, which has to be agreed to by the trustees, you can reduce past benefits. Ultimately, what we have seen in that process is people taking away pension increases rather than reducing pensions in payment. And I think ultimately it's a very hard thing to do, is to take something away from somebody who's worked all their life to get.
How do we get a fair system?
I think ultimately, we can talk about the inequalities in the pensions system, and there's inequalities all over the place. You've got inequality between people in the private sector and public sector. You've got inequalities between people who are in DB and people who have to fund themselves through a defined contributions system. I think trying to get a fair system, I think ultimately will move everybody into defined contribution. I think there will have to be...
We're all going to have to pay for our own future.
I think ultimately that is the future here. And I think there will be some level of compulsion there. We have to force people to save, because ultimately we've over half the workforce here with no pension whatsoever.
People don't want to save. People don't like pensions.
No, people aren't meant to like it, but they will like it even less if they get to the point of retirement. Ultimately, the state pension is unaffordable. And if we were to try and fund the state pensions currently in existence, your PRSI rate would have to go from 14.75% to 27%. Now, you don't want that either. So ultimately, if the state can't afford to fund for pensions, individuals are going to have to cough up.
OK, and on that nice cheerful note of more money going out of our income every month, thank you very much, Samantha McConnell, Chief Investment Officer with IFG Pensions. If you're on a DB scheme, let us know. Should your benefit go down every week or every month when you're paid out, let us know. 531